The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel Phillips Huntington. Chapter 2: Civilizations in History and Today. Relations among civilizations. Encounters. Civilizations before 1500 AD. The relations among civilizations have evolved through two phases and are now in a third. For more than 3,000 years after civilizations first emerged, the contacts among them were, with some exceptions, either non existent or limited or intermittent and intense. The nature of these contacts is well expressed in the word historians use to describe them: encounters. Civilizations were separated by time and space. Only a small number existed at any one time, and a significant difference exists, as Benjamin Schwartz and Samuel Eisenstadt argued, between axial age and pre-axial age civilizations in terms of whether or not they recognized a distinction between the transcendental and mundane orders. The axial age civilizations, unlike their predecessors, had transcendental myths propagated by a distinct intellectual class: the Jewish prophets and priests, the Greek philosophers and sophists, the Chinese literati, the Hindu Brahmins, and the Buddhist Sangha and the Islamic ulama. Some regions witnessed 2 or 3 generations of affiliated civilizations, with the demise of one civilization and interregnum, followed by the rise of another successor generation. Figure 2.1 is a simplified chart reproduced from Carroll Quigley of the relations among major Eurasian civilizations through time. Civilizations were also separated geographically. Until 1500, the Andean and Mesoamerican civilizations had no contact with other civilizations or with each other. The early civilizations in the valleys of Nile, Tigris and Euphrates, Indus and Yellow rivers did not interact. Eventually, contacts between civilizations did multiply in the eastern Mediterranean, southwestern Asia, and northern India. Communications and commercial relations were restricted, however, by the distances separating civilizations and the limited means of transport available to overcome distance. While there was some commerce by sea in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, steppe traversing horses, not ocean traversing sailing ships, were the sovereign means of locomotion by which the separate civilizations of the world, as it was before 1500 AD, were linked together, to the slight extent to which they did maintain contact with each other. Ideas and technology moved from civilization to civilization, but it often took centuries. Perhaps the most important cultural diffusion, not the result of conquest, was the spread of Buddhism to China, which occurred about 600 years after its origin in northern India. Printing was invented in China in the 8th century AD and movable type in the 11th century, but this technology only reached Europe in the 15th century. Paper was introduced into China in the 2nd century AD and came to Japan in the 7th century and was diffused westward to Central Asia in the 8th century, North Africa in the 10th, Spain in the 12th, and Northern Europe in the 13th. Another Chinese invention, gunpowder, made in the 9th century, disseminated to the Arabs a few hundred years later and reached Europe in the 14th century. The most dramatic and significant contacts between civilizations were when people from one civilization conquered and eliminated or subjugated the people of another. These contacts normally were not only violent but brief, and they occurred only intermittently. Beginning in the 7th century AD, relatively sustained and at times intense intercivilizational contacts did develop between Islam and the West and Islam and India. Most commercial, cultural, and military interactions, however, were within civilizations. While India and China, for instance, were on occasion invaded and subjected by other peoples, Mughals and Mongols, both civilizations also had extensive times of warring states within their own civilization. Similarly, the Greeks fought each other and traded with each other far more than they did with Persians or non Greeks. Impact. The rise of the West. European Christendom began to emerge as a distinct civilization in the 8th and 9th centuries. For several hundred years, however, it lagged behind many other civilizations in its level of civilization. China under the Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties, the Islamic world from the 8th to the 12th centuries, the Byzantium from the 8th to the 11th centuries, far surpassed Europe in wealth, territory, military power, and artistic, literary, and scientific achievement. Between the 11th and 13th century, European culture began to develop, facilitated by eager and systematic appropriation of suitable elements from the higher civilizations of Islamic and Byzantium, together with the adaptation of this inheritance to the special conditions and interests of the West. During the same period, Hungary, Poland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic coast were converted to Western Christianity, with Roman law and other aspects of Western civilization following, and the eastern boundary of Western civilization was stabilized where it would remain thereafter without significant change. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Westerners struggled to expand their control in Spain and did establish effective dominance of the Mediterranean. Subsequently, however, the rise of Turkish power brought about the collapse of the Western Europe's first overseas empire. Yet by 1500, the renaissance of European culture was well underway, and social pluralism, expanding commerce, and technological achievements provided the basis for a new era of global politics. Intermittent or limited multidirectional encounters among civilizations gave way to the sustained, overpowering, unidirectional impact of the West on all other civilizations. The end of the 15th century witnessed the final reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors and the beginnings of Portuguese penetration of Asia and Spanish penetration of the Americas. During the subsequent 250 years, all of the Western Hemisphere and significant portions of Asia were brought under European rule or domination. The end of the 18th century saw a retraction of direct European control, as first the United States, then Haiti, and then most of Latin America revolted against Europe's rule and achieved independence. In the later part of the 19th century, however, renewed Western imperialism extended Western rule over almost all of Africa, consolidated Western control in the subcontinent and elsewhere in Asia, and by the early 20th century, subjected virtually the entire Middle East except for Turkey to direct or indirect Western control. Europeans or former European colonies in the Americas controlled 35% of the Earth's land surface in 1800, 67% in 1878, and 84% in 1914. By 1920, the percentage was still higher as the Ottoman Empire was divided up among Britain, France, and Italy. In 1800, the British Empire consisted of 1.5 million square miles and 20 million people. By 1900, the Victorian Empire, upon which the sun never set, included 11 million square miles and 390 million people. In the course of European expansion, the Andean and Mesoamerican civilizations were effectively eliminated. Indian and Islamic civilizations, along with African, were subjugated, and China was penetrated and subordinated to Western influence. Only Russian, Japanese, and Ethiopian civilizations, all three governed by highly centralized imperial authorities, were able to resist the onslaught of the West and maintain meaningful independent existence. For 400 years, intercivilizational relations consisted of the subordination of other societies to Western civilization. The causes of this unique and dramatic development included the social structure and class relations of the West, the rise of cities and commerce, the relative dispersion of power in Western societies between estates and monarchs, and the secular and religious authorities, the emerging sense of national consciousness among Western people, and the development of state bureaucracies. The immediate source of Western expansion, however, was technological. The invention of the means of ocean navigation for reaching distant people and the development of the military capabilities for conquering those people. In large measure, as Jeffrey Parker has observed, the rise of the West depended upon the exercise of force, upon the fact that the military balance between the Europeans and their adversaries overseas was steadily tilting in favor of the former. The key to the Westerners' success in creating the first truly global empire between 1500 and 1750 depended upon precisely those improvements in the ability to wage war, which have been termed the military revolution. The expansion of the West was also facilitated by the superiority in organization, discipline, and training of its troops, and subsequently by the superior weapons, transport, logistics, and medical services resulting from its leadership in the Industrial Revolution. The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, to which few members of other civilizations ever converted, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. In 1910, the world was more one politically and economically than at any other time in human history. International trade as a proportion of the gross world product was higher than it had ever been before and would not again approximate until the 1970s and 1980s. International investment as a percentage of the total investment was higher than at any other time. Civilization meant Western civilization. International law was Western international law, coming out of the tradition of Grotius. The international system was the Westphalian system of sovereign but civilized nation states and the colonial territories they controlled. The emergence of this Western defined international system was the second major development in the global politics in the centuries after 1500. In addition to interacting in the domination subordination mode with the non-Western societies, Western societies also interacted on a more equal basis with each other. These interactions among political entities within a single civilization closely resembled those that had occurred within China, India, and Greek civilizations. They were based on a cultural homogeneity which involved language, law, religion, administrative practice, agriculture, landholding, and perhaps kinship as well. European peoples shared a common culture and maintained extensive contacts via an active network of trade, a constant movement of persons, and a tremendous interlocking of ruling families. They also fought each other virtually without end. Among European states, peace was the exception, not the rule. Although for much of this period, the Ottoman Empire controlled up to one-fourth of what was often thought of as Europe. The empire was not considered a member of the European international system. For 150 years, the intra-civilizational politics of the West was dominated by the great religious schism and by religious and dynastic wars. For another century and a half, following the Treaty of Westphalia, the conflicts of the Western world were largely among princes, emperors, absolute monarchs, and constitutional monarchs, attempting to expand their bureaucracies, their armies, their mercantilist economic strength, and, most important, the territory they ruled. In the process, they created nation states, and beginning with the French Revolution, the principal lines of conflict were between nations rather than princes. In 1793, as R. Palmer put it, the wars of kings were over. The wars of people had begun. This 19th century pattern lasted until World War I. In 1917, as a result of the Russian Revolution, the conflict of nation states was supplemented by the conflict of ideologies, first among fascism, communism, and liberal democracy, and then between the latter two. In the Cold War, these ideologies were embodied in the two superpowers, each of which defined its identity by its ideology, and neither of which was a nation state in the traditional European sense. The coming to power of Marxism, first in Russia and then in China and Vietnam, represented a transition phase from the European international system to a post-European multi-civilizational system. Marxism was a product of European civilization, but it neither took root nor succeeded there. Instead, modernizing and revolutionary elites imported it into non-Western societies. Lenin, Mao, and Ho adapted it to their purposes and used it to challenge Western power, to mobilize their people, and to assert the national identity and autonomy of their countries against the West. The collapse of this ideology in the Soviet Union and its substantial adaptation in China and Vietnam does not, however, necessarily mean that these societies will import the other Western ideology of liberal democracy. Westerners who assume that it does are likely to be surprised by the creativity, resilience, and individuality of non-Western cultures. Interactions, a multi-civilizational system. In the 20th century, the relations among the civilizations have thus moved from a phase dominated by the unidirectional impact of one civilization on all others to one of intense, sustained, and multi-directional interactions among all civilizations. Both of the central characteristics of the previous era of intercivilizational relations began to disappear. First, in the favorite phrases of historians, the expansion of the West ended and the revolt against the West began. Unevenly and with pauses and reversals, Western powers declined relative to the power of other civilizations. The map of the world in 1990 bore little resemblance to the map of the world in 1920. The balances of military and economic power and of political influences shifted and will be explored in greater detail in a later chapter. The West continued to have significant impacts on other societies, but increasingly the relations between the West and other civilizations were dominated by the reactions of the West to developments in those civilizations. Far from being simply the objects of Western-made history, non-Western societies were increasingly becoming the movers and shapers of their own history and of Western history. Second, As a result of these developments, the international system expanded beyond the West and became multi-civilizational simultaneously. Conflict among Western states, which had dominated that system for centuries, faded away. By the late 20th century, the West has moved out of its warring state phase of development as a civilization and towards its universal state phase. At the end of the century, this phase is still incomplete as the nation states of the West cohere into two semi-universal states in Europe and North America. These two entities and their constituent units are, however, bound together by an extraordinarily complex network of formal and informal institutional ties. The universal states of previous civilizations are empires. Since democracy, however, is the political form of Western civilization, the emerging universal state of Western civilization is not an empire but rather a compound of federations and confederations and international regimes and organizations. The great political ideologies of the 20th century include liberalism, socialism, anarchism, corporatism, Marxism, communism, social democracy, conservatism, nationalism, fascism, and Christian democracy. They all share one thing in common. They are products of Western civilization. No other civilization has generated a significant political ideology. The West, however, has never generated a major religion. The great religions of the world are all products of non-Western civilization and, in most cases, antedate Western civilization. As the world moves out of its Western phase, the ideologies which typified late Western civilizations decline and their place is taken by religions and other culturally based forms of identity and commitment. The Westphalian separation of religion and international politics, an idiosyncratic product of Western civilization, is coming to an end, and religion, as Edward Mortimer suggests, is increasingly likely to intrude into international affairs. The intra-civilizational clash of political ideas spawned by the West is being supplanted by an intercivilizational clash of culture and religion. Global political geography thus moved from one world of 1920 to three worlds of the 1960s to the more than half dozen worlds of 1990s. Concomitantly, the Western global empires of 1920 shrank to much more limited free world of the 1960s, which included many non-Western states opposed to communism, and then to the still more restricted West of the 1990s. This shift was reflected thematically between 1988 and 1993 in the decline in the use of the ideological term free world and the increase in use of the civilizational term the West. See Table 2.1. It is also seen in increased references to Islam as a cultural political phenomenon. Greater China, Russia and its near abroad, and the European Union, all terms with a civilizational content. Intercivilizational relations in this third phase are far more frequent and intense than they were in the first phase and far more equal and reciprocal than they were in the second phase. Also, unlike the Cold War, no single cleavage dominates and multiple cleavages exist between the West and other civilizations and among the many non-Wests. An international system exists, Hedley Bull agreed, when two or more states have sufficient contact between them and have sufficient impact on one another's decisions to cause them to behave, at least in some measure, as parts of a whole. An international society, however, exists only when states in an international system have common interests and common values, conceive themselves to be bound by a common set of rules, share in the working of common institutions, and have a common culture or civilization. Like its Sumerian, Greek, Hellenistic, Chinese, Indian, and Islamic predecessors, the European international system of the 17th and to the 19th centuries was also an international society. During the 19th and 20th centuries, the European international system expanded to encompass virtually all societies in other civilizations. Some European institutions and practices were also exported to these countries. Yet these societies still lack the common culture that underlay European international society. In terms of British international relations theory, the world is thus a well-developed international system, but at best only a very primitive international society. Every civilization sees itself as the center of the world and writes its history as the central drama of human history. This has been perhaps even more true of the West than of the other cultures. Such mono-civilizational viewpoints, however, have decreasing relevance and usefulness in a multi-civilizational world. Scholars of civilizations have long recognized this truism. In 1918, Spengler denounced the myopic view of history prevailing in the West with its neat division into ancient, medieval, and modern phases relevant only to the West. It is necessary, he said, to replace this Ptolemaic approach to history with Copernican one, and to substitute for the empty figment of one linear history, the drama of a number of mighty cultures. A few decades later, Toynbee castigated the parochialism and impertinence of the West manifested in egocentric illusions that the world revolved around it, that there was an unchanging East, and that progress was inevitable. Like Spengler, he had no use for the assumption of the unity of history, the assumption that there is only one river of civilization, our own, and that all others are either tributary to it or lost in the desert sands. 50 years after Toynbee, Brodel similarly urged the need to strive for a broader perspective and to understand the great cultural conflicts in the world and the multiplicity of its civilizations, the illusions and prejudices of which these scholars warned, however, live on and in the late 20th century have blossomed forth in the widespread and parochial conceit that the European civilization of the West is now the universal civilization of the world.